What if the person you humiliate today is the one who holds your future tomorrow? A cruel restaurant manager smirked as he mocked a struggling mother in front of her young son. He had no idea that a man in a hoodie, quietly sitting in the corner, was watching everything. And that man was Shaquille O'Neal. What happened next shocked everyone in the diner, especially the manager, because when Shaq finally stood up, everything changed. Hey, real quick, before we get into this wild story, hit that subscribe button and drop a comment. Where are you watching from? The doorbell jingled as Shaquille O'Neal stepped into the warm glow of the small family diner. A gust of cold air followed him inside, making the few customers glance up briefly before returning to their meals. Dressed in a plain hoodie and a cap pulled low over his face, Shaq didn't stand out. That's how he liked it. Sometimes he just wanted to enjoy a quiet meal without drawing attention. He exhaled, rubbing his hands together for warmth, and made his way toward a booth near the back. But before he could even sit down, something caught his attention. A voice, soft but strained. At a corner booth near the window, a woman with tired eyes and an old winter coat sat across from a small boy, no older than 6 or 7. He clutched a crayon, aimlessly drawing on a napkin, his stomach audibly growling. His mother, Sarah, as he would later learn, leaned forward, speaking in hushed tones to the waiter, a young woman with kind eyes and an apologetic expression. "I'm so sorry," Sarah murmured. "I only have a few dollars. Could I just get something small for my son?" The waiter, Lisa, bit her lip and glanced toward the counter, where a middle-aged man with slicked-back hair and a smug expression stood watching. Todd, the manager. Before Lisa could respond, Todd sauntered over, wiping his hands on his apron, a smirk tugging at the corner of his lips. "This ain't a charity, lady," Todd said loudly, making sure everyone in the diner heard. "If you can't pay, you can't stay." A heavy silence fell over the room. The little boy looked down, his small fingers gripping the crayon tightly. His ears burned red with embarrassment as he tugged at his mother's sleeve, whispering, "Mom, let's just go." Sarah swallowed hard, blinking rapidly. She opened her purse, rummaging through it with shaking hands, hoping to find a few more coins. Shaq, seated just a few feet away, gripped his menu a little tighter, his jaw clenched. He didn't like what he was seeing. Shaq was no stranger to generosity. He had quietly paid for people's meals, covered strangers' groceries, even bought a young athlete a new car once. But he had learned something over the years. Sometimes stepping in too quickly made people uncomfortable. Sometimes the best way to handle a bully was to let them expose themselves first. So he waited. Todd crossed his arms, glancing around the diner, as if expecting applause for humiliating a struggling mother. "Look, lady, I don't run a soup kitchen," he added, chuckling to himself. Lisa shifted uncomfortably, clearly wanting to help, but knowing she could get in trouble if she did. Sarah forced a tight smile, her pride keeping her from begging. "I understand," she whispered, standing up. The boy quickly followed, his eyes on the floor. Shaq had seen enough. Slowly, he set his menu down and exhaled through his nose. Instead of reacting with anger, he leaned back in his seat, his eyes narrowing as he watched Todd strut back toward the counter, grinning. Shaq wasn't just going to buy Sarah and her son a meal. He was about to teach Todd a lesson he'd never forget, and it was going to start right now. Sarah gripped her son's tiny hand, trying to steady her breathing. The weight of humiliation pressed down on her shoulders as Todd's voice echoed through the diner. "I said, this ain't a charity," Todd repeated, crossing his arms. His smirk widened as he noticed other customers looking away, pretending they didn't hear. No one wanted to get involved. The little boy, clearly sensing his mother's embarrassment, lowered his head, his eyes shimmering with unshed tears. He squeezed her hand tighter, and that's when Lisa, the young waitress, took a deep breath and stepped forward. "Sir," Lisa started cautiously, glancing at Todd. I can cover their meal. It's not a big deal." Todd turned his head sharply, his smirk vanishing. "Excuse me?" His voice was low, but the venom was unmistakable. Lisa swallowed hard but stood her ground. I don't mind paying. She just wants something small for her son. It's the right thing to do." Sarah's eyes darted between Lisa and Todd, surprise flickering across her exhausted face. Shaq, still seated a few booths away, quietly watched everything unfold. His hands were folded on the table, but his grip was tightening. He had seen arrogance before. He had encountered plenty of people like Todd in his life. But something about this particular moment, about the way Todd was treating a struggling mother in front of her child, lit a slow fire in his chest. Todd let out a sharp laugh, shaking his head in disbelief. "You want to pay for every broke customer who walks in here?" he sneered. "You think you're some kind of hero? Lisa's hands trembled slightly, but she nodded. If it means a kid doesn't go to bed hungry, then yeah. The diner was silent. Todd scoffed, shaking his head. You're lucky to even have this job, he muttered, loud enough for everyone to hear. Lisa stiffened, her cheeks flushing red. Shaq's jaw clenched. He had seen enough. Gently, he set his menu down and exhaled through his nose, a quiet but deliberate sound. He wasn't about to let this continue, but he also wasn't going to handle it the way Todd expected. This wasn't just about paying for a meal. It was about making sure Todd learned a lesson he'd never forget. Slowly, Shaq leaned back in his seat, cracking his knuckles. Then he waved Lisa over. Lisa hesitated, glancing at Todd, but when she looked at Shaq, something about the calm in his eyes reassured her. She took a deep breath and walked over. Todd, still smirking, rolled his eyes. Oh, what now? Shaq ignored him. Instead, he looked directly at Lisa and asked, how long has he been treating people like this? Lisa's eyes widened. Todd's smirk faltered. And just like that, the balance of power in the room shifted. Shaq leaned forward slightly, keeping his voice low as Lisa stood beside his table. The tension in the diner was thick, the air heavy with embarrassment and cruelty. He had seen enough, but he wasn't going to blow up or call Todd out just yet. No, this required a smarter approach, one Todd wouldn't see coming. Tell me about her, Shaq asked, his deep voice calm but firm. Lisa hesitated, glancing at Sarah, who sat quietly in the corner booth, her hands folded in her lap. Her little boy, head down, traced patterns on the table with his fingers. Lisa sighed, lowering her voice. She used to come in here all the time, back when things were better. Her husband passed away last year. Car accident. After that, everything fell apart. She lost her job, the bills piled up, and now she barely comes in. Lisa swallowed hard. I think tonight was a last attempt to feel normal. Shaq clenched his jaw. He had heard stories like this before, and each time they cut deep. Hard-working people, struggling to stay afloat, treated like less than human because they fell on hard times. He couldn't stand it. And Todd? That man had no idea who he had just disrespected. Shaq reached into his pocket, pulling out his credit card. I need you to do something for me. Lisa blinked. Oh, okay. Take this to the cashier, Shaq instructed, sliding the black card into her hand. Pay for every single meal in this diner. No exceptions. Lisa's mouth parted slightly in shock. Wait, everyone's meal? Shaq nodded. Yep, every single one. Lisa stared at him. Don't tell him who paid, Shaq added. I want to see how this plays out. Lisa hesitated, then nodded. She knew better than to argue with a man like Shaquille O'Neal. Without another word, she turned and walked toward the cashier. Shaq picked up his menu again, acting as if nothing had happened. Meanwhile, Lisa whispered something to the cashier, who raised an eyebrow in shock before glancing toward Shaq. Lisa nodded, and a moment later, the cashier swiped the card. One by one, receipts printed. Meanwhile, Todd was still leaning against the counter, smug as ever, clearly enjoying Sarah's discomfort. But then something changed. Wait, what's going on? A customer asked, noticing that the cashier was handing out receipts without taking any money. Who paid for this? Another customer murmured, holding up his check, which now showed a total balance of 0. Sarah, still gripping her son's tiny hand, looked up, confused. I didn't, she whispered. The murmurs grew, and suddenly the energy in the diner shifted. Confusion turned into excitement. Whispers turned into amazed chatter. But one person wasn't thrilled. Todd frowned, pushing himself off the counter and stomping toward the register. What the hell is going on? He demanded. Lisa kept her back straight, but Shaq could see the nervous way she gripped the edge of the counter. The cashier cleared his throat. Someone covered the bill for everyone, sir. Todd's eyes widened in disbelief. What? He snatched a receipt from the counter and squinted at it. $0? What is this? Some kind of joke? Lisa exhaled through her nose and looked at Shaq out of the corner of her eye. Shaq kept his face neutral. He wasn't ready to make his move yet. Todd turned, scanning the diner. All right, who did it? He barked, his voice laced with irritation instead of gratitude. Sarah looked up, her eyes wide with disbelief, still clutching her son's hand. Lisa swallowed hard, keeping her promise. I don't know, she said evenly. Todd's lip curled. Oh, come on, he snapped. Someone's got to be feeling all high and mighty. Who's the hero? His eyes scanned the room, landing on Shaq for a split second before moving on. He had no idea who he was messing with. Shaq simply leaned back in his seat, picking up his water glass and taking a slow sip. Todd's frustration grew, his fists clenched, his face turning red. Todd took a deep breath, then marched toward the middle of the diner. All right, listen up, he shouted, silencing the growing chatter. I don't know who pulled this stunt, but I don't appreciate it. This ain't a charity. Whoever paid for these meals, speak up. Right. Now. Shaq set his glass down. A smirk tugged at the corner of his lips. Todd had no idea what was coming next. The diner, once buzzing with excitement over the mysterious act of kindness, suddenly fell into tense silence. Todd's voice cut through the air like a blade, sharp and filled with disdain. What, you think you're special? He sneered, marching toward Sarah's booth. This isn't a damn soup kitchen. Shaq exhaled slowly, gripping his fork a little tighter. He had hoped Todd would take the high road, maybe acknowledge the kindness, maybe show an ounce of decency. But no, Todd was doubling down. Shaq's patience was running thin. Sarah's face turned a deep shade of red as she instinctively pulled her son closer. The little boy, no older than 6, shrank into his mother's side, his tiny fingers curling around the fabric of her coat. Sarah tried to keep her voice steady. I didn't ask for this, she whispered, glancing around the diner. Todd scoffed. Oh, please. What, did you bat your eyelashes at some soft-hearted fool? Got them to feel sorry for you? His lips curled in disgust. Pathetic, Lisa gasped audibly from behind the counter. A few customers shifted uncomfortably in their seats. One man muttered under his breath, Dude, just let it go. But Todd wasn't finished. He leaned in closer, towering over Sarah's small frame. You think you can just sit here, eating food on someone else's dime, like you deserve it? Shaq clenched his jaw. He had seen a lot of things in his life. Poverty, struggle, injustice. But watching a man humiliate a mother in front of her child over a meal, that was crossing a line. A heavy silence hung in the air. People were watching, waiting. Sarah's eyes shone with unshed tears. She wasn't weak, Shaq could tell. She had likely endured worse than Todd's cruelty. But humiliation in front of her son, that hurt in a different way. She inhaled shakily, then sat up straighter. I never asked for charity, she said quietly, her voice laced with dignity. Todd let out a short, humorless laugh. Right, he turned to Lisa. You see this? This is exactly why people like her stay broke. They get comfortable taking handouts. Shaq had heard enough. He set his napkin down, pushed his chair back, and stood to his full height. The room shifted. A few gasps. A sudden hush. Todd turned toward the movement and found himself staring at a chest, because that's all he could see before his gaze traveled up, and up, and up. The realization hadn't hit him yet, but it was about to. Shaq folded his arms over his broad chest, his deep voice cutting through the tension like a knife. I think it's time for a new approach, he said, his tone calm but firm. Todd's smirk faltered. Shaq took a step forward. Phase 2 of his plan was officially in motion. Todd's smirk returned as he crossed his arms. He had humiliated Sarah, dismissed Lisa, and now he stood tall, convinced that he was untouchable. But Shaq? Shaq wasn't done yet. He had seen enough. It was time to flip the script. Shaq turned to Lisa, his voice calm but purposeful. Hey, can I ask you something? Lisa, still rattled by Todd's outburst, hesitated before stepping closer. Of course. Shaq leaned down slightly, lowering his voice. How much does Todd make here? Lisa's eyebrows shot up. Todd? She cast a nervous glance at her manager, who was still looking smug. Not much. Maybe a couple bucks more an hour than me, but he acts like he owns the place. Shaq nodded thoughtfully. And what about Sarah? Before, before everything fell apart? Lisa frowned. She was doing all right before her husband passed. Probably made about the same, maybe even more. Shaq exhaled, shaking his head. Figures. Todd had spent the last 10 minutes lording over Sarah like she was beneath him, like she didn't deserve to be here. But in reality, he was barely in a better position himself. Yet instead of understanding struggle, he mocked it. That didn't sit right with Shaq. Shaq pulled out his phone. Lisa's eyes widened. What are you doing? She whispered. Shaq gave her a wink. Making things interesting. He pressed a contact and brought the phone to his ear. Hey, he said casually. I need a favor. Lisa leaned in slightly, curiosity taking over her fear. Todd, on the other hand, was starting to notice. His cocky demeanor wavered as he watched Shy whisper into the phone. Yeah, Shaq continued. That thing we talked about? Let's do it. He nodded once, listening to the response. Cool, give me 10 minutes. He hung up and tucked his phone back in his pocket. Lisa blinked. What? What just happened? Shaq grinned. You'll see. Todd, now visibly irritated, stormed over. What the hell are you two whispering about? He demanded, his voice sharp with paranoia. Lisa instinctively stepped back. Shaq, however, didn't flinch. He simply turned and looked Todd dead in the eye. Wouldn't you like to know? Todd's jaw clenched. If you're causing trouble, I will have you thrown out. Shaq chuckled. You think so? Todd glared at him, but there was something in Shaq's expression that made him hesitate. A shift was happening in the diner. The customers were watching, waiting. Todd had spent the whole evening feeling in control, but now it felt like something was slipping, and he didn't like it. Before Todd could say another word, the diner's front door swung open. A sharply dressed man walked in, scanning the room with a knowing smirk. Todd stiffened. What is he doing here? Shaq smirked back. Oh, just making sure the right people hear about tonight. Todd's face drained of color. Everything was about to change. Todd's voice dripped with frustration as he stormed toward Shaq, his shoes smacking against the tile floor. Who do you think you are? He snapped, his hands balled into fists. Shaq remained seated, his massive frame relaxed as if he had all the time in the world. His hoodie was still pulled low over his face, concealing his identity. But there was no mistaking the quiet confidence in his posture. He barely glanced up before responding. Just a guy who doesn't like bullies. Todd scoffed. Oh yeah? Well, I don't like people who stick their noses where they don't belong. He leaned closer, lowering his voice. So I'm going to give you one chance to mind your business and walk out of here. Shaq exhaled slowly, shaking his head. That's the problem with guys like you. You think respect is something you take, but real respect? That's something you earn. Todd's face turned red. The tension in the diner was thick enough to cut with a knife. The customers were no longer eating. All eyes were locked on the unfolding confrontation. Lisa stood frozen by the register, watching anxiously. Sarah clutched her son's small hand, whispering for him to stay quiet. And then, the door swung open again. The sharply dressed man who had just entered stepped forward, adjusting his suit jacket. His eyes scanned the room until they landed on Shaq. A wide grin stretched across his face. Ah, there he is, the man said, his voice carrying just enough authority to make Todd tense up. Todd whipped his head toward him. Wait, you know this guy? The man chuckled. Know him? Todd, do you ever watch basketball? Todd blinked, confused. What does basketball have to do with... And then Shaq moved, slowly, deliberately. He reached up and grabbed the edges of his hoodie, pulling it back. The room collectively gasped. Todd took a step back, his confidence crumbling in an instant. His eyes darted from Shaq's towering figure to the man in the suit, who was now grinning like a kid in a candy store. Oh, man, a customer muttered from across the diner. It's Shaq, a woman gasped. Shaquille O'Neal? No way. Todd's mouth opened and closed like a fish out of water. He stumbled backward, nearly tripping over a chair. Shaq tilted his head. Now, what was that about me walking out of here? Todd stammered. You're... Shaq gave him a slow, knowing nod. Yeah, I am. Lisa's hands shot up to her mouth. Sarah's son's eyes went wide. Even Sarah, who had been holding back tears of humiliation, looked up in disbelief. The energy in the diner had shifted. A few moments ago, Todd had been in control. Now he was terrified. With one smooth motion, Shaq rose from his seat. Todd instinctively stepped back again. Shaq towered over him, his massive frame casting a shadow across the diner floor. For the first time that night, Todd wasn't smirking. He wasn't mocking anyone. He was speechless. Shaq crossed his arms. You like embarrassing people, Todd. Feels good, huh? Todd swallowed hard. Shaq leaned in slightly, lowering his voice just enough for Todd to hear. Well, guess what? Now it's your turn. Todd's face drained of color. A murmur spread through the crowd. People were pulling out their phones, whispering excitedly. Lisa's eyes darted between Todd and Shaq, anticipation buzzing in her chest. Sarah's son gripped his mother's sleeve. Mom, he whispered. He's huge. Sarah nodded, still too shocked to speak. The diner had never been this quiet before. And then Shaq took another step forward. Todd flinched. But Shaq? He simply smirked. He wasn't done yet. Shaq turned to the sharply dressed man. You ready? The man grinned. Oh, I was born ready. Todd's face twisted in confusion. What does that mean? Shaq cracked his knuckles. You're about to find out. Todd swallowed hard. He had been the one humiliating people all night. But now the tables had turned. The diner was no longer just a quiet, run-down little restaurant. It was now electric. The moment Shaq pulled back his hoodie, the entire room had collectively gasped. And then, as if on cue, a teenage boy near the counter yelled out the words that made Todd's stomach drop. Yo, that's Shaq! the diner erupted. Todd's once arrogant smirk vanished. His face turned ghostly white as whispers and murmurs spread like wildfire. Customers whipped out their phones, snapping pictures and recording videos. Some stood up, eyes wide in disbelief. "Shaquille O'Neal?" An older man at the counter muttered, adjusting his glasses. "No way!" a woman gasped. "Are you kidding me? He's been here this whole time." Even Lisa, who had been standing quietly, covered her mouth with both hands. Her eyes darted between Shaq and Todd, as if waiting for the final blow. But the one who was the most stunned? Sarah. She blinked, struggling to process what was happening. Her son, eyes bright with excitement, tugged on her sleeve. "Mom!" he whispered urgently. "It's Shaq!" Sarah barely nodded, still speechless. Meanwhile, Todd stood frozen. His confidence, his power, had vanished in an instant. The way customers looked at him had changed. A minute ago, he had been the self-proclaimed king of the diner. Now, under Shaq's towering presence, he looked small, pathetic even. He opened his mouth as if to say something, but no words came out. For the first time that night, Todd wasn't the one talking. He was the one being watched. Shaq exhaled, shaking his head slowly. "Man," he said, his deep voice cutting through the chaos. "I've seen a lot of things in my life." He turned toward Sarah and her son, his expression softening. "But this," he gestured toward Todd. "This is a first." Todd flinched. What's that supposed to mean?" Shaq folded his arms. "I mean, I don't think I've ever seen a manager this eager to ruin his own business." Laughter rippled through the crowd. A few people clapped. Todd's eyes darted around the room, panic creeping into his expression. Shaq leaned down slightly, his massive frame looming over Todd. "You know," Shaq said, his voice calm but firm, "it takes a real special kind of guy to mock a single mother and try to humiliate a woman who just wanted to help her." Todd took a step back. "Look, I was just doing my job." "Your job?" Shaq raised an eyebrow. "Nah, Lisa was doing her job. You were just being a—" He paused, choosing his words carefully. "Let's just say, a very bad human being." The room roared with approval. Lisa giggled, covering her mouth. Sarah's son laughed out loud. Even Sarah, who had spent the entire evening holding back tears, let out a tiny chuckle. Shaq turned to Lisa. "You work here?" Lisa nodded hesitantly. Yeah. "You like your job?" Lisa shrugged. "I mean, I did. But working under him?" She glanced at Todd. "Not so much." Shaq smirked. "Noted." Todd's face was burning. "Look," Todd stammered, "I don't know what you think you're doing, but—" "Oh," Shaq interrupted, cracking his knuckles. "I know what I'm doing." At that moment, the sharply dressed man who had entered earlier stepped forward. He had been watching silently, but now he spoke. "Shaq?" the man said with a grin. "You want me to make the call now?" Shaq grinned back. "Yeah, go ahead." Todd's breath hitched. Wait, what call?" The man pulled out his phone, typing something quickly. Shaq clapped his hands together. "Ladies and gentlemen," he announced to the diner, "I think it's time for a little justice." Todd's stomach twisted. What? What does that mean?" he asked nervously. Shaq smiled. "You're about to find out." The man put his phone to his ear. "Yeah, it's me. He's right here." He paused, listening. Then he smirked. "Cool. You're going to want to see this for yourself." Todd's face turned pale. His hands trembled. Whatever was about to happen, it wasn't going to be good. Todd's heart pounded against his ribs. The moment the sharply dressed man on the phone said, "You're going to want to see this for yourself," he knew, deep down, this wasn't going to end well. His palms grew clammy. His confidence had completely shattered. And Shaq? Shaq was just standing there, arms crossed, smirking, waiting, watching. Todd swallowed hard. "Wha? Who did he just call?" Shaq leaned in slightly. "Oh, don't worry," he said with a grin. "You'll find out real soon." The diner door swung open, and in walked the one person Todd never expected to see. A tall, silver-haired man in a tailored suit strode in, his expression unreadable. The restaurant owner, James Holloway, Todd's boss. Todd immediately straightened up, forcing a nervous smile. "Mr. Holloway," he stammered. I didn't know you were coming." James didn't even look at Todd. Instead, he walked straight up to Shaq, extending his hand. "Shaquille," James said warmly. "It's been a long time." Todd's stomach dropped. Shaq shook his hand, nodding. "Good to see you, James." James turned to the sharply dressed man who had made the call. "So, what's going on here?" The man glanced at Shaq, who simply gestured toward Todd. "I think he should explain," Shaq said. Every pair of eyes in the diner locked onto Todd. He let out a dry, nervous laugh. Well, You see, Mr. Holloway, Todd stuttered. There was a misunderstanding. James raised an eyebrow. Oh? Enlighten me. Todd scrambled for words. This woman, he pointed at Sarah, she came in and she didn't have enough money to pay. And, I was just enforcing the policy. James's expression remained stone cold. Go on, he said. Todd gulped. And then Shaq showed up and, well, I didn't realize it was him at first, but Shaq cut him off. Nah, Todd, he said coolly. You didn't mess up because you didn't recognize me, he pointed at Sarah. You messed up because you didn't recognize her worth. The room fell dead silent. Lisa covered her mouth. Sarah clutched her son's hand tightly, her eyes watering. Even James's face hardened. Todd's hands trembled. Sir, James finally spoke. Todd, he said firmly, step outside now. Todd's heart nearly stopped. His boss had never spoken to him like that before. Sir, I don't understand, Todd stammered. James's jaw tightened. What's not to understand? He asked sharply. This is a family diner. We serve people, not humiliate them. Todd frantically looked around the room, searching for someone, anyone, to back him up. No one did. Even the other customers, some of whom Todd had served for years, were shaking their heads at him. Sir, please, Todd begged. I didn't mean, I don't want to hear it, James interrupted. You're fired. Gasps echoed throughout the diner. Sarah's son let out a quiet, whoa. Lisa's jaw dropped. Shaq smirked. Todd froze. His lips parted, but no sound came out. James crossed his arms. Leave your apron at the counter, he said. You're done here. Todd stood there, paralyzed. It was over. The king of the diner had just been dethroned, and worst of all, he knew he deserved it. Todd slowly turned toward Lisa, his face twisted with anger. You, he spat. You knew this was happening, didn't you? Lisa blinked. What? Todd pointed at her. You and Shaq, you set me up. Shaq chuckled. Man, you set yourself up. Lisa shook her head. Todd, I literally just tried to help a struggling mother. You turned it into something ugly. Todd clenched his fist, but James cut in. And speaking of Lisa, James said, glancing at her. Lisa stiffened. Sir? James smiled. How'd you like to be promoted to manager? Lisa's eyes widened. What? She gasped. Shaq clapped his hands together. Now that's what I'm talking about. James nodded. We need someone in charge who actually cares about people. Lisa covered her mouth, tears forming in her eyes. I don't know what to say, she whispered. Shaq grinned. Say yes. She laughed through her tears. Yes, oh my God, yes. The entire diner burst into cheers. Even Sarah clapped, her son bouncing excitedly beside her. Meanwhile, Todd looked like he was going to throw up. Unbelievable, he muttered under his breath. Lisa turned to him, her smile fading slightly. I think you should go now, Todd, she said. Todd glared at her, but he knew he had no choice. With a scowl, he ripped off his apron, tossed it onto the counter, and stormed out of the diner. The bell above the door jingled as it swung shut behind him, and just like that, he was gone. Shaq turned to Sarah, his expression softening. We're not done yet, he said. Sarah looked confused. What do you mean, she asked. Shaq simply smiled. You'll see. Sarah blinked, glancing down at her son, who looked up at Shaq with curiosity. What else could he possibly have planned? Whatever it was about to change everything. Tears welled up in Sarah's eyes as she gripped her son's hand. The chaos of the last few minutes, the confrontation, Todd's downfall, Lisa's promotion, had left her stunned. But now Shaq was looking right at her, and she had no idea why. Come here for a second, he said softly, reaching into his pocket. Sarah hesitated, exchanging a glance with her son. Then cautiously, she stepped forward. And what Shaq did next changed everything. Shaq pulled out a check from his jacket. He unfolded it slowly, then turned it so Sarah could see. Her breath caught in her throat. The number staring back at her was so unbelievable that for a second she thought she was seeing things. $5,000. Sarah's hands shook. What? What is this? Shaq smiled. Something to help you and your son get back on your feet. The room froze. Lisa gasped. The customers whispered in shock. Even James, the restaurant owner, looked taken aback. Sarah staggered back, one hand over her mouth. I can't accept this, she stammered. It's too much. Sarah, Shaq interrupted gently. You don't have to say anything. Tears rolled down her cheeks. She couldn't speak. Her son tugged at her sleeve. Mom? She turned, her lips trembling. Shaq knelt down to the boy's level. his massive frame towering over him even as he crouched. "You like basketball, kid?" The boy sniffled and nodded. "Yeah," Shaq grinned. "Good, 'cause I just set you and your mom up with courtside seats to the next game." The little boy's jaw dropped. Sarah sobbed. The entire diner was silent, not because people weren't speaking, but because they were too overwhelmed to find the words. One by one, people began clapping, softly at first, then louder and louder. Lisa wiped at her eyes. James nodded in approval. A few customers even pulled out their phones, capturing the moment. Sarah fell to her knees, gripping the check like it was the most precious thing in the world. "I don't know how to thank you," she whispered. Shaq placed a hand on her shoulder. "Just promise me one thing." She looked up, her eyes red. "Anything," Shaq smiled. "When you get back on your feet, help someone else." Sarah let out a broken laugh, nodding. "I will, I swear I will." Her son clung to her, beaming. "Mom, we're gonna be okay." Sarah sobbed harder. "And Shaq?" He just smiled. Shaq leaned in, whispering something into the little boy's ear. His eyes widened, his face lighting up in pure excitement. "What did he say?" Lisa asked curiously. The boy grinned, looking up at his mother. But he didn't answer. Not yet. Because some things were meant to be revealed at just the right moment. A week had passed since that unforgettable night at the diner. A lot had changed, for Sarah, for her son, and for Todd. But no one was prepared for what was coming next. Because sometimes life has a way of giving people exactly what they deserve. Sarah stood in front of the mirror, smoothing out the crisp white apron wrapped around her waist. She could hardly believe it. A new job, a fresh start, and all because of one incredible act of kindness. Thanks to Shaq, she had landed a stable position at a local bakery, a job that not only paid well, but also allowed her to take care of her son without struggling to make ends meet. She blinked back tears, adjusting her name tag. Sarah, assistant manager. Who would have thought? Just days ago, she had been humiliated in front of strangers, unable to afford a simple meal for her child. And now, she had a future again. Her heart swelled with gratitude as she tied her hair back and stepped into the bakery. As soon as she walked in, the owner, a kind elderly woman, smiled. "Morning, Sarah. Ready for your first day?" Sarah beamed. More than ready. She had been given a second chance, and she was going to make the most of it. Across town, things weren't looking so bright for Todd. He stood outside a coffee shop, gripping a newspaper, scanning the job listings for what felt like the 100th time. His fingers tightened around the paper. No one would hire him. Ever since word had gotten out about what happened at the diner, every job interview ended the same way. Polite smiles, an awkward pause, then a rejection. "Sorry, but we're looking for someone who values customer service." Or worse, "We don't think you're the right fit for our company culture." Todd's stomach twisted with frustration. How had things fallen apart so fast? Just a week ago, he had been the one in charge, barking orders, mocking struggling customers. Now he was the one struggling, and for the first time, he understood what it felt like to be powerless. He looked down at his empty coffee cup. No one had paid for his meal. Karma had come full circle. Meanwhile, back at their small apartment, Sarah's son sat at the kitchen table, scribbling in his notebook. His eyes sparkled as he carefully wrote down something he had been holding on to for a week now, something precious. His mom glanced over and smiled. "What are you working on, sweetheart?" The boy grinned but didn't answer right away. Instead, he clutched the tiny slip of paper Shaq had given him that night at the diner, the one he had kept hidden in his pocket ever since. Sarah wiped her hands on a towel and knelt beside him. "Hey," she whispered, "you never told me. What did Shaq say to you that night?" The little boy looked up, his small fingers tightening around the note. Then finally he spoke. "He told me, never let anyone tell you you're not worth it." Sarah's chest tightened. Tears burned in her eyes as she gently brushed her son's hair back. She swallowed hard, her voice barely a whisper. "And do you believe him?" Her son nodded firmly. "Yeah, because he believed in you, Mom." Sarah pulled him into her arms, hugging him tightly. And for the first time in a long time, she believed it too. A single act of kindness can change a life, but cruelty, it always comes back around.